Major General Alok Dev, SMVSM, commanded his artillery regiment in Operation Vijay, where it was awarded the Chief of Army Staff Unit citation and the honor title Kargil. A former general officer commanding of a artillery division, he has held important staff appointments in all ranks. He was also one of the colonel commandments of the Regiment of Artillery, Indian Army, till his superannuation. Currently, he is the DDG IDSA. So, my first question for you. On February 17, 2020, the Supreme Court of India took a decision to provide equality of opportunity for women seeking permanent commission in the Indian Army. An article that you have authored speaks about the importance of this move in leveling the playing field by means such as equal access to training and other things. However, a law might not be enough to change the stereotypes and biases held against women officers in the army. So, in your opinion, what other measures can be taken to support not only the existing women, but also the young women seeking to join the Indian Army?
Thank you, Dhruvika. Just a small amendment. I used to be the Deputy Director General of the IDSA. I have since come back home now. And coming on to your question, just a few statistics in the beginning. The army has around 42,000. I'm talking about the army only. 42,000 officers, of which around 1,600 are women. So you can work out the percentages. The medical services all over the country, the Army Medical Services, Armed Forces Medical Services, have around 2,000 lady doctors and around 5,000 nursing officers. And based on the Supreme Court judgment of February, the Army was to give out its policy on how exactly they're going to get everybody into the permanent commission and the implications of all that. It had asked for a 6-month extension the other day. Because of COVID, they weren't able to get things in place, but the Supreme Court has given them just a month's extension. At the same time, there's a report also that the women officers in the army have approached the Supreme Court saying that the physical tests which are being planned for them are discriminatory and they should be looked at again. So the Supreme Court has said, hang on, let's first take it step by step. Let's see what the army's rules are. So that's where the factual position is as of now.
Okay.
Coming on to the macro level, we need to look basically at the issue in two ways. One is to look at capability and the other is to look at the mindset.
Right.
So you look at the capability and you look at the mindset. As far as capability is concerned, you've got to have, provide absolute clarity on what the job entails. And imagine if tomorrow some soldiers are sent to another checkpoint in Ladakh to check out whether the Chinese have vacated a position or not. And some of these are women. So what therefore should the capabilities comprise of?
Okay.
So they are capabilities with regard to physiological issues. And these capabilities with physiological issues pertain to both men and women. It's not that all men are supermen and all men can pass all their tasks. No. A large number of men in military also fail their physical tests, are also found to be unfit. So it isn't that a man always passes and a woman cannot pass. Right. Essentially, issues of the physiological issues about upper body strength and being more prone to injury, etc. These are known. But again, as I said, these are problems for the men too. Essentially, what we're looking at is gender neutral capabilities. And there's no harm in accepting as a principle that we are not looking at a military where for the sake of political correctness, your gender balance has to be 50-50. I mean, you're not looking at that. You're looking at whosoever can qualify, most welcome. Imagine tomorrow you have a mixed team playing rugby or something. So whoever is prepared, whoever is fit, most welcome. And this gender neutral capability is not just on the field, it's off the field also. And it encompasses everything. It encompasses tactical skills, leadership. At the same time, you don't have to compete in everything. I mean, there are things which prudence dictates. There's certain things you compete in better, certain things you compete in lesser. The boss should also know where a woman might do the job better, where a man might do the job better. So there's no harm in that because you have to use these specific skills which come in. We come to the mindset. Now, women, if they find the going difficult in the beginning, and some will, some definitely will. So, firstly, they have to stop thinking of themselves as victims. They should have to stop thinking of themselves as victims, and you have to prove yourself in all fields and be prepared for what comes because there's going to be hardship, there's going to be deprivation, and at the same time, you can't rule out that odd, unsavory encounter because human nature being what it is. So there will be some unsavory encounters, and people have to be prepared for it. It involves staying single. It involves breaking many traditional modes: when to have children, where to keep them, how to rear them, and you have to be prepared to delink family from duty. It's a very difficult choice. And women in the army and women who are at sea will have the most difficult time. Of course, the Navy hasn't permitted women yet to go to sea. The Air Force luckily stays in bases, there are no issues there. Then there are many personal management issues related to career progression, recruitment. How many should you recruit? How many should you not recruit? And things of that nature. And of course, providing facilities wherever possible, whether it is separate washrooms, whether it is billeting separately. If it is not possible, it's not possible. If you're staying with four, if you're four of you only staying in a remote area, then well, it's not possible. So these are things we have to see. So that's where the mindset comes in. So there has to be a consensus that yes, there has to be an acceptance of all this on both sides without any dilution of operational efficiency because that's the bottom line. Without any dilution of operational efficiency. And this mindset is not just for women, it's for men also. Because men need to respect women more as individuals instead of looking at all women through the same lens.
Right.
Okay. Instead of looking at all women through the same lens, you look at women as individuals and you say, yes, so and so is good, so and so can do it, so and so is good, but so and so is not able to do it. So all this will happen. You can respect a woman more individually when she proves herself in this particular field, which she's chosen on her own without any compulsion. Because the male attitude presently, it's a mix. It's part chivalrous, it's part protective, it's part dismissive, it's part overbearing. So this will have to change. You'll have to look at women as equals, but you don't give them a second chance because they're a woman. You don't give them extra chances because they're women. You give them the same number of chances. Because in combat, you won't get a second chance.
Right.
I hope I am making myself clear as to
Yes.
where we stand. So let's see, let the military promulgate rules. Let's see what these rules are like. Let's see what these gender neutral rules imply in terms of capabilities across the board. As far as mindset is concerned, I think we'll have to go in for a lot of counseling when these things come in because we'll have to do this and get people in place. There's no tearing hurry. It's one step at a time. I hope that answers you to some extent.
It does. Thank you. I think Shreyas has a question.
Yes, sir. So, with the rise in technological advancement and military systems in general, uh, and military systems will be looking forward towards modernization. So, you've previously written about how factors such as the available resources and funds, as well as the work and cooperation of various organizations and bodies, such as the NSCS, DRDO, the MOD, and more, will affect the attainment of a technologically advanced military system. With this in mind, we have two sort of sub questions for you. The first one being, what steps can an organization like DRDO take in terms of furthering progress in indigenous military technology?
I wrote a paper on this about 2 or 3 years ago, and after that, the government has put up an organization which takes care of many of these gaps. I'm talking about the Defense Planning Committee, which was constituted in, I think, April 2018. And this is a committee which is chaired by the National Security Advisor. And it has the Defense Secretary, the Foreign Secretary, and the Expenditure Secretary as members. And the Chief of Defense Staff also would be a member. It hasn't been announced as yet, but that's what the composition would be. Now, this Defense Planning Committee, it's got 4 pillars. It's got 4 subcommittees. One is on policy and strategy. And what that's essentially going to do is to prepare the national security strategy and the national defense strategy. That is one. The second is the planning and the capability development subcommittee. And that's going to look at creating a capability development plan. That's going to look at monitoring, timely implementation. It's essentially looking to forge synergies between various ministries on these matters of defense and security and break silos. Then there's something called the Defense Diplomacy Subcommittee, which is going to evaluate foreign policy objectives, create complementary defense engagement, leverage our defense attaches for foreign acquisitions. And then there's a Defense Manufacturing Subcommittee, which will draft a comprehensive policy for R&D, including a roadmap for indigenization. So this basic framework is in place, and the silos are to be broken at the apex level through macro level coordination. And some beginning has been made already. Now coming to the DRDO per se, you may be aware that the DRDO makes a program called the Long-Term Technology Perspective Plan, the LTTPP. It's a perspective plan. It's for 15 years. And this technology perspective plan runs in sync with the Indian Armed Forces Long-Term Integrated Perspective Plan. This is done by the Integrated Defense Staff, which is coming under the CDS, Department of Military Affairs. So the military has a long-term integrated perspective plan, and the DRDO has a long-term technology perspective plan. Now the DRDO people in their headquarters, they've got a technology forecasting group, which looks into technologies worldwide, which keeps updating this technology perspective to keep it in sync, because while warfighting methods do change, but technology changes much, much faster. I think VIT will know far more about it. So to ensure that you stay on top of technology and don't get crushed under it like a road roller, this technology forecasting goes on. DRDO done something quite novel. I don't know, maybe VIT knows about it, but it was the Prime Minister's initiative. They've started something called Young Scientist Labs. And this has happened very recently, early this year. I don't know if you know about it yet.
I've heard a little about it.
These are 5 laboratories which are in 5 metros. There's one in Bangalore, Hyderabad, Chennai, Mumbai, and Calcutta. And these 5 labs, the great thing about them is that all their people there, including their director, are below the age of 35. So these are young scientists. And they are looking at new things. They're looking after artificial intelligence. They're looking after quantum computing. They're looking after cognitive technology. They're looking after asymmetric technology, and they're looking after smart materials. So these are 5 labs looking at 5 totally new things, totally new in the context of development within India. So this is something which is very novel, and they're all young, and we hope it goes somewhere. DRDO has also started working far more closely with Corporate India. It started outsourcing certain projects to Corporate India to help it, because it realizes it can't do everything itself. And the aim essentially is to look at dual use technologies and see how well it can be done, used for the military. They've also got things, they're looking at PPEs, they've started making robots. So the systems are in place. The issue lies, as always, in India with the delivery and how to ensure that the delivery is done in the envisaged time up to user satisfaction. That challenge remains. Because to fulfill user expectations and to translate it into a product instead of just a technology demonstrator, that's where the challenge lies. As regards what field of R&D has the most potential for developing military technology, I don't know whether you all are aware of that classic conundrum, whether technology drives doctrine or whether doctrine drives technology. For example, right from the days of Icarus, when people wanted to fly, and the Wright brothers, they invented the aeroplane. So that was their dream, to fly. And then the military applications came through. At the same time, when somebody wanted a longer range weapon from a musket or a rifle, somebody invented the Gatling gun. And that resulted in changes of tactics on how to deploy this. So this is a interchangeable thing. One drives the other. Sometimes factor A drives B, sometimes B drives A. So essentially, what are we looking at now? Now, what we're looking at is methods to promote non-contact warfare. There is contact warfare, there is non-contact warfare. Now, this non-contact warfare too is of two kinds. It is non-contact kinetic and it is non-contact non-kinetic. When it is non-contact kinetic, you're looking at standoff weapon systems. Some of them are dumb, some of them are smart, some of them are air-launched, some of them are whatever. And you're looking at non-contact, non-kinetic, that is where computing comes in a big way, whether it is satellites, whether it is artificial intelligence, whether it is sensors of various types, electronic, biological, whether it is surveillance, whether it is unmanned underwater vehicles, whether it is remotely piloted vehicles, whether it is bombs, satellites, lasers, rockets, and missile domains. I hope I've given you a sense of where we are.
Right. Yes. On the same note, so in the light of current pandemic situations, economies around the world, including that of India, have taken a hit. And countries will obviously be seeking to recover from the effects of this pandemic for the coming few years. And this could potentially affect the available resources, funds, and also the human resources. So, what changes do you foresee, and how can the country continue moving towards military modernization?
So that's a difficult question because there's no doubt it's going to affect modernization. We have to be practical about it. What it might actually result in a shifting of priorities. The percentage of the defense budget to the GDP is around 1.44. It's below 1.5. That includes DRDO also. Then it will have an effect on capital procurement. I hope you all understand the difference between capital and revenue procurement. Capital is long-term assets, and revenue is something to keep the thing going. Like if you're buying a weapon system, that's a capital asset. But when you're sending repeat orders for ammunition and spares, those are revenue assets. A salary is revenue, stuff like that. So there are certain hard choices we have to do. You've seen what the Chinese have done. So do we therefore, you also read that the acceptance of necessity for purchasing of aircraft, it's been cleared by the Defense Acquisitions Committee. Purchase of Sukhois, purchase of MiG-29s, stuff like that will happen. So what do we do? So we have also something called committed liabilities, where we have laid down that once we've signed on the dotted line for a particular acquisition, we have to pay it, say, in a 5-year span or a 10-year span or a 15-year span, whatever decided upon, we pay so much every year. So that's a committed liability, which we cannot afford to default upon. So there are very hard choices to be taken in this matter. It will have some effect, but to my mind, what we'll have to do is to reprioritize and see that for the immediate, to ensure that these threats are addressed, we have to do something. And as far as our long term is concerned, yes, we'll have to look at as and when we get a little more leeway, maybe we can increase the amount of funding for the defense budget.
All right. And so one more question. So India currently produces around 45 to 50% of its defense products, while the rest is imported. And in fact, amidst the recent crisis in Eastern Ladakh, the Ministry of Defense even started reaching out to countries such as the US to ensure early supply of pending deals. However, we know that the Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, has called for a self-reliant India as a pathway of recovering from COVID-19. So what do you think this means for the defense system of India? Is it important to have an entirely self-reliant military? Or are such deals, international deals, important to the military as well?
It's a very complex situation. I know for sure that there have been at least 5 studies in the last 20 or 30 years or so looking at this problem and to decide how to make things better. Yes, for the last 5 years, India has been the world's second largest arms importer, and we have a mix of equipment, and that includes vintages. Every country decides they have a percentage. How much of your equipment is current? How much of equipment is state of the art, and how much of your equipment is vintage? Vintage in the sense it's not as current as it could be, and based on what your adversaries have, based on the funding you think you're going to get, based on the technology you feel is available, based on what you can afford, you decide these percentages. They vary from country to country. So at the same time, in India, we have a slightly piquant situation. We have a slight conflict of interest because you have the armed forces, which are the customers, and you also have some public sector undertakings and the ordnance factories, which are the manufacturers, and both come under the Ministry of Defense. So it's not a very clean buyer-seller relationship. And at the same time, the public sector undertakings and the ordnance factories aren't really supposed to make much profit out of all this. They're just supposed to cover their running costs and whatever are the future plans. So overall, it's not a very, very clear buyer-seller relationship. That's one. Secondly, for market economics, for things to progress, a seller would like to sell as much as possible. But if India wants just 100 K9 Vajra self-propelled guns, then Larsen and Toubro perforce makes only 100 self-propelled K9 Vajra guns. It doesn't make any more. So where does that leave Larsen and Toubro once they finish? This is just an example. The basic economics, because we need only this much. We don't need an unlimited supply. Probably what the best thing to make in larger quantities is the personal weapon, like a rifle. So things like that, yes, there are economies. Otherwise, economies of scale are very difficult to come by. Because what the military is actually looking for is something which turns out to be high cost. Something which turns out to be high cost. The military wants it at a low cost. The military wants high quality, and the military wants it as soon as possible. So reconciling all this with the environment I just told you becomes difficult. A little more on the budget, which we just touched last time. The budget, actually, it was for 2021, it was 4.7 lakh crores. It was overall 15% of the central government expenditure. That's a lot. So purely in terms of what the country is allocating, we know we require more. At the same time, 15% of the entire expenditure of the country is on defense. So to reconcile this, to make sure we don't get caught napping, because if we have to upgrade ourselves to state-of-the-art system, we do need more money. So that is also a fact. Obtaining foreign technology comes with strings attached, and most importantly, do we have the ecosystem in place to absorb all that we get? Because while I may understand the technology which is being offered to me, but for me to translate it into working on ground and make sure that it can be replicated in adequate numbers of the same quality, I need the infrastructure and the ecosystem in place. I also need people to understand. I need acquisition people to understand. I need acquisition professionals who've been working on this all their lives. I don't need someone who's come for 3 years and goes away somewhere else. For example, in the Office of the United States Acquisition, Office of United States Acquisition and Sustainment, it employs 170,000 people full time. That's the way they do it. But we're making efforts. We've got a new category of capital procurement. It's called Buy Indian, Indigenously Designed, Developed and Manufactured, IDDM, to encourage indigenous design. We also have something else called Buy Indian. We have something called Buy and Make Indian. So these are various nuances. They have a lot of implications, but essentially we are looking at it. We've had some major policy reforms in May this year, May 2020, to promote self-reliance by notifying a list. That list is about to come out. The Department of Military Affairs, the CDS, will do it. What items of import we need to ban? In the sense, we have to make it ourselves. And we are going to have a separate budget for domestic capital procurement. We are going to corporatize the ordnance factory boards. I just saw an advertisement. They're looking for a consultant who can come and advise on how to corporatize the ordnance factory board. Giving incentive to foreign vendors to contribute more and stuff like that. The last point I want to make is there's a difference between self-reliance and self-sufficiency.
Okay.
Self-reliance and self-sufficiency. If you're self-sufficient, you've got everything in your kitty sitting at home, excellent. But self-reliance is a little beyond that, in the sense you may not have everything here, but you have certain strategic partners on whom you can bank, and you have adequate arrangements with that. So we have to look at all these things.
Right. So
That's
with
it.
that, I'll go on to the next line of questioning. Now, what we've seen as a movement in warfare is more towards economic, biological, and cyber warfare. So, how equipped do you think India is towards safeguarding against such warfare, and what measures do you think can be taken in this regard in the future?
I know you are engineering students of technology, but I'm going to take you into a bit of history. Uh, Baron Karl von Clausewitz, military theorist, 18th century, Prussia, where he wrote that famous treatise, 13 volumes on war. So Clausewitz said that the nature of war doesn't change. It remains violent, it remains interactive. But the character of war changes. As you apply force throughout the ages under different conditions, the character of war changes, but the nature of war doesn't change. Prosecution of warfare is predicated by social, political mores, cultures, technologies, methods of war fighting, new organizations. There's another point in theory I want to bring out. There's a difference between war and conflict. War entails conflict, but conflict doesn't entail war. You may have a conflict with your neighbor, raise your fist at him. That's conflict, but that's not war. And there are a range of terms: uh, guerrilla war, irregular war, proxy war, low intensity conflict, subconventional warfare, surrogate warfare, hybrid warfare, non-linear wars, gray zone wars, asymmetrical wars, threshold wars, what have you. These could be between states, between a state and a non-state actor, between two non-state actors. And many of these terms have commonalities, they have differences, but all of these are joined by that one great enabler, and that is technology. Now, countries have got the economies interlinked, like India and China. Countries have got their supply chains interlinked, and they rely on systems which cut across boundaries. So it's not very simple to go to war the way it used to be earlier after the Treaty of Westphalia, 1648, when you had nation states. France and England in the 1300s and 1400s, they had the 100 Years' War. They fought for 100 years. You can't have that now. The costs of conventional war are very, very high. Therefore, it forces countries to look at other options, at low cost options, using new tools, new technologies. Cyber, AI, quantum computing, Internet of Things, weaponization of information for influence operations, long range precision systems, low tech, easily available weapons such as mini drones. These entities, they fight in various combinations with other elements of national power, whether it is economic, whether it is political, whether it is diplomatic, to pressurize, divide, subvert your target state. So where is India in this regard? Of course, most of this is hush hush, but you heard that we have a space division now, we have a special forces division now, we have a defense cyber agency now. These are three agencies which have been raised under the Chief of Defense Staff over the last 2 years or so. We have the National Critical Information Infrastructure Protection Center, NCIIPC. It's got a website. You can have a look at it. And they are the guys to ensure that the information infrastructure, critical areas, is safeguarded. They work under the NTRO. So we have the Defense Image Processing and Analysis Center. So we have instruments like this. But is war as we understand over? No, it isn't. War is only supplemented by this. War thus becomes multidimensional, and war becomes multi-domain. I say again, multi-dimensional and multi-domain. We are creating continuous capability. We are creating conventional capability also continuously. We've got the C-17 Globemasters, which are huge strategic lift capabilities. We are upgrading our advanced landing grounds where the C-130s can land. You've got the Apache helicopter gunships, which can provide tremendous firepower to ground forces. We've got the ultralight howitzer, which can be picked up by a helicopter, taken across and deployed to provide firepower of the intimate, effective, close support kind. We have these things. So our employment of force is always under review. And the bottom line is that all this employment of force is predicated on what we wish to achieve. What is our notion of victory? What exactly do we want? We want to capture a nation? Question mark. Do we want to capture territory? Question mark. Do we want to destroy war waging potential? Question mark. Do we want to do some Salami slicing? Question mark. Do we want to just give a symbolic slap on the face? Question mark. So you decide. Based on what your political aim is, you decide what are the instruments to employ. And based on what the political aim is, you decide on the force capability and the force structuring you want to do. And that's how you're going to fight the next war.
As a final question, so what role do you see the youth of India playing towards enhancing the Indian military? And if there's a message or advice you could give to the youth watching this, what would it be?
As far as the youth of India are concerned, know about your military, feel confident about your military. If you have the passion, join the military. It isn't a job, it's a way of life. So if you have the passion, join. And remember, it isn't a job, it's a way of life. You can't come to your unit and say, where is my office? You may not have an office at all. But at the same time, the military life isn't for everybody. It doesn't suit every temperament. And there's no harm in that. There's no harm in that. Because the larger message is to serve. As the current corona crisis has shown, everybody, when it comes to it, is a soldier. That person who's ensuring that Mumbai streets have to remain unclogged in the torrential rain. It's the street cleaners who are cleaning the societies. It is the maids who come and ensure that the garbage still goes. It is the paramedic who comes and gives you that shot. It's the medicine shop owner who's staying with his shop open and meeting hundreds of customers without fear, the doctors. So the larger issue is that you must serve. You must serve your nation in whichever capacity your temperament permits. Yes, if you want to join the military will be very happy to have you. But otherwise, look to serve. That gives life a lot of meaning. That's what I would say.
All right. Thank you so much, sir. It was really a pleasure talking to you. And we're very happy we had this opportunity.
Thank you so much. And it's always innovating to talk to young people because you people are the future of this country. So my best wishes to you in your future endeavors. Thank you very much.
To you too, sir.